Welcome to this, another in these classical next gramophone conversations, and I'm delighted to be joined today by somebody we were discussing the other day, who I reckon I've known for 22 years, and in those 22 years, she's had a number of orchestras in her care, and about just recently started a new chapter in Austria. And it is, of course, Marin Alsop. So a very, very warm welcome across the seas.
Great to be here with you, James.
Now, we're obviously in lockdown, and talking to quite a few musician friends, they've nearly all said that actually making music is a kind of physical necessity for them. Singers have said, I just have to sing, and I don't really care what level it is, I just have to sing. I mean, for you as a conductor, obviously, not having an orchestra makes, the day job quite tricky if you're stuck at home. But do you just feel a terrible lack of music in your life at the moment?
It's not just about the music, but the physical sensation of creating or being involved in the sound. While we don't, as conductors, we're not actually producing any of the sound ourselves. Because of our gesture, we're interacting with the sound. And so I miss that feeling of kind of just engaging with the sound of the orchestra. It almost feels like letting an addiction go or something, that kind of, it's almost painful in a way, not feeling that connection and you don't realize, I think, how important it is until you don't have it.
It's a very physical job. It's an amazing balance between, the intellectual, the emotional, and the physical. But it always strikes me that, so many conductors live to such an incredibly old age and keep working. Do you think is there an exercise part of conducting, cardiovascular or something like that actually is very, very good for people?
Well, knock on wood, I'll knock here for myself. But of course, I think, I've noticed the changes in my body because normally I stand for 6-8 hours a day. And while I'm not just standing still, I'm constantly moving and torquing and turning and bending and leaning. And I think I've really missed that. So I've had to incorporate into my Zoom routine that after every call, I just kind of run around the block and at least move and keep that going because I really miss the physicality of the conducting. It's the physicality combined with the intellectual challenge, and the stimulus that is so magical for me about conducting. It's bringing both of those together. And so I've tried to, I think now I'm getting the hang of it now that we're almost hopefully out of this period.
Now, I said at the beginning, you recently started a new role in Austria of the Vienna Radio-Symphonieorchester. Looking back over your career, how does a conductor sort of manage a career? Is there a time when you think, actually, it's time to move on from an orchestra? Since I've known you, as I said, you've been in charge of the Bournemouth Symphony, the Sao Paulo Symphony, and the Baltimore Symphony orchestras. You finished with Bournemouth, obviously, with Sao Paulo. You're in your last season in Baltimore. When do you decide, actually, or perhaps why do you decide it's time to move on?
I think in many ways, that's the hardest part of our job as a conductor is, because we make these deep connections, not just with the musicians, but with the community. And I'm very attached to the people here in Baltimore, to my home, it's become home. And I felt the same way in many ways in Bournemouth and also in Sao Paulo and everywhere I've been. So I think it's important to make these decisions if you can, as objectively as possible, because I think if we were to make them subjectively, we might never leave a place, because it's so painful to have to really uproot yourself and detach. But I think there are moments in organizations' trajectories that feel like the correct moment to leave. From my perspective, I wanted to achieve certain things everywhere I went. And once I had achieved those, and I perhaps if I'd stayed twice as long, I could have found a new set of goals and achieved those. But it's often good to have a refresher, for everyone in terms of artistic insight, artistic vision, even just manner. It's nice to have a change up. And I think I've been successful in gauging those times. I don't know if I could articulate it very well. But, here in Baltimore, I mean, we've achieved so many things artistically on the artistic front, and even in terms of trying to move forward in the relationship with the community. And I think I've pushed them as far as we can go, and I'll continue. I mean, for me, probably the greatest pride is that with all of these orchestras, I have an ongoing relationship, particularly with Sao Paulo, where I'm conductor of honor, and here in Baltimore, I'll be conducting 3 weeks every year, at least for 5 years. So, it's not that kind of sudden separation. There'll be a continuity, and hopefully I can stay connected to the community.
I've always been very struck when I've been in America, and quite often I've been invited to the inaugural concerts by a number of conductors. So, I mean, I was in, I think, San Francisco when MTT went there, and I was in Philadelphia when Christoph Eschenbach started. And I always get the sense in America, particularly, that there is an enormous civic pride in an orchestra, in a city. I can't imagine in London, banners hanging from the lamppost saying, the LSO welcomes.
Oh, but don't you have? I think you're experiencing that though now with the arrival of Simon Rattle taking over the LSO.
I think Simon Rattle is actually what probably was a difference, but I just remember being very struck when I was in San Francisco and MTT's arrival, and there was his profile on the things, and it was SFS MTT, which was all very kind of neat. But I mean, do you find in Baltimore that you do find you've been sort of embraced by the city in something a little bit more than just the chief conductor of their orchestra? I mean, do you feel it's more of a kind of social role in the States?
Well, I think it is a different role, and we're much more like ambassadors for our art form to the community. But I mean, I have to say that as I look at the future or the near future in American orchestras, I mean, it's quite an interesting period, because when I leave Baltimore, that will be the last American conducting a major U.S. orchestra. So there will be no Americans, and certainly being the only woman, that means there'll be no women heading the orchestras. And I think at this time, in particular, it's very, very important that we start to look at how we can create a sense of relevance, not just this kind of civic pride. That's fine, but I think orchestras have an enormous potential to be huge advocates of not just classical music, but art and creativity to their communities. And that's something I've really tried to spearhead here in Baltimore. And I feel a deep connection to the broader community, beyond just the orchestra family members, but really to the city at large. And perhaps that's just the person I am. I don't know, but I think we see at this historic moment in time that this is something that is required from every institution, every industry, to really think about their responsibility to the community.
Because an orchestra it's a fascinating sort of organism, because essentially you've got, 100, 120 people each with very distinct personalities. Yet, to bring off a great performance, they've all got to sort of pull in the same direction. And to an extent, they've got to respond to the beliefs or the vision of their leader, the person standing on the podium, but not to the extent that their individual personalities are sort of subsumed into this kind of sort of mass. I mean, I suspect for a lot of people, who are encountering an orchestra for the first time, it must be quite fascinating. And I think there was a little period, perhaps back in the 90s, when orchestras actually used to invite sort of people from, industry to come and sit amongst them just to see how, as a sort of a machine, an orchestra works. I mean, do you find that, sort of people are intrigued as to the sort of dynamic between you as the orchestral boss and then these players, but at the same time cultivating their individuality?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, I think something we've learned from this lockdown time is that there are other ways to connect with audiences that can give them access and behind the scenes looks at what we're doing, which I think are very exciting opportunities. Hopefully the orchestras will continue to be receptive to those concepts. But I think symbolically, the orchestra is a fantastic microcosm of our broader society. How does one set the stage to get many people of very strong ego to enable them to be the best they can be? I mean, and that's the goal of any CEO of a company, any boss, anyone, any leader, is to try to get the people that you're working with to be the best they can be and surround yourself with the highest level people possible. So that's really, I think that's very palpable for business leaders or for leaders in any industry to immediately see the parallels. I see how that's working, because you could even look at it in terms of a direct correlation that if the conductor is the CEO, then, you have these top managers as the leaders of the sections, and then you have their groups, their departments, and somehow they have to communicate, but also the departments have to, there has to be this incredible level of communication that's constant and clear. You have to, and of course in orchestras, it's without words as well. So it's pretty easy to visually grasp. So I think it's a quite fascinating dynamic to experience for people.
Because it's quite unusual to think of a parallel to the orchestra, because, if one thinks about the stage director or the football manager, when it actually comes to the performance or the game, they actually take themselves out of the picture and leave it to their performers. But actually, you're always there as a conductor, which means that actually there's an element of spontaneity, because you can, on a whim, decide to do something, and hopefully the orchestra will come with you, which again is a sort of fascinating thing to see. I mean, I've long been sort of amazed at the art of the conductor, and I've always been hugely relieved that nobody has actually been able to explain it, because I think it would lose a lot of its magic if, somebody just said, well, actually, this is how it's done, because there is no real way of saying how it's done.
No, it's quite true. It really is very ephemeral to try to articulate it. Just you think you have it and then it goes away. But I have to say that for me the greatest concerts are a combination of my presence being completely unnecessary because we've rehearsed so well, and also that kind of split-second decision making where you decide just to steer the vehicle slightly differently. Something sets you up and you say, let's go for it. Let's really go for it. And those are absolutely thrilling moments, and they're impossible to anticipate or to set up. They happen.
And how long do you think it takes a conductor to get to that position where what you need to rehearse, what you don't need to rehearse, what is going to take care of itself in performance, and what actually needs attending to. Because, I mean, quite often as a conductor gets older and gets more experienced, one of the things I've noticed is that their movements get less and less and less and less. So, someone whose career I sort of watched for a long time was Colin Davis. And as a young man, if you see films of him conducting in the 60s, he was flailing around all over the place. And by the time, he'd got into his last stint at the LSO, he would barely move. And you can, I mean, Bernstein was a little bit like that. He would literally stop conducting for, minutes on end.
Yeah, but that's, that is almost like, going on the high wire without the net. That was his version of that. But I do think as a young conductor, one of the biggest things to battle against is doing too much, learning the lesson that less is more. And especially when the level of the orchestra is so high that the less you do, the more you enable them to do. So I think that your observation is spot on, that as conductors get more experienced and more insightful about the orchestra, and if it's your own orchestra, you start to know them so intimately that you know how much they need, when they need you, and when they don't need you, and try to respect that space to let them come forward and take over. So I think it's all, like so many things in life, it's a matter of balancing it, and trying to find that point where everything is just right there in sync.
And do you think is there a difference in the way you approach concerts with your own orchestra, or you're basically a guest job? So you're turning up, you've probably never conducted these people before. I mean, that must be very different to turning up in Baltimore or Sao Paulo or whatever, where kind of you're halfway there almost before you've even lifted your stick. I mean, is it a different discipline, guest conducting, to?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's very, very different. I think, every person is different. I think the way we as conductors relate to guest conducting is very much of a representation of who we are as human beings. For me, as you know, James, being friends together for 22 years, I'm not a person that makes friends overnight and then, moves on. I'm a person that I really like friendships to evolve and relationships to develop and depth to occur. But some people are just great and extroverted and they love going in and, just have a party and then we're gone. I think people with that personality probably fare better in terms of the guest conducting life. For me, I find it fascinating. I love meeting people, but I find it also frustrating that as soon as I start to get somewhere, I have to say goodbye. So I miss the building process. That's my favorite thing with orchestras and with any kind of project I'm working on, is how can we make this more profound an experience and more meaningful for everyone.
And how quickly, as a conductor, when you arrive and first rehearsal, I mean, how quickly do you know that there's something special going on? There is a chemistry that just magically has happened, and perhaps conversely, when you just think, this is just not working. I mean, we're going to make a good fist of it, but, I'm not crazy about coming back.
While this would be a gross generalization, I think probably within the first 5 minutes. It's a bit like first impressions. People say you have only one chance to make a first impression. And first impressions are quite lasting and quite telling, usually. And I can tell almost immediately if there's something special that's going to happen and if there's a chemistry. Conversely, you can tell if, maybe this is not going to go. And then you try to work around it and work toward some kind of meaningful outcome. But I would say it's just like meeting people. You usually know within the first few minutes if you want to be friends with that person.
Now, you've made, a real sort of, it's part of your kind of message is contemporary music, new music and championing sort of the new. I mean, there are some conductors who basically, they have had a very narrow repertoire. They basically went around the world doing 20, 25 works and that's it. I mean, in your role as conductor, I mean, do you see that as absolutely core to what you need to do to basically keep the orchestral or the concerto repertoire expanding the whole time?
Well, I do. I feel that as the messenger for the composer, it's really critical that I champion the voices of today. And I feel a deep responsibility to put forth and represent the creative minds and the composers who I value. And so I feel a deep commitment. I mean, I think, look, Beethoven was new music once too. So without advocacy, without champions, the creative voice has no outlet. So I think it's really important that we all, as conductors, advocate for composers.
I remember about sort of 22 years ago, in our first one of our first official interviews, which mercifully was not done in public. And I remember asking you a question, which if I'd actually sat and reflected before I'd asked it, I would have never asked it. And that's, what's it like being a woman conductor? To which you very crisply came back and said, well, as you'd never been a man conductor, you really weren't in a position to comment. Now that was 2 decades ago. And when I look around the world at the sort of major conducting posts, or even the kind of second tier conducting posts, there are still not many women in major roles. But underneath that sort of surface, there are quite a lot of women guest conductors. I mean, how do you think the situation has changed, over the last 20 years?
Well, I'm surprised. And even after you asked me that question, I said, let's still be friends. I'm just kidding, James. I think that I'm encouraged about the opportunities that have recently started opening up. I'd say in the last 5 years, probably, for women. But as we know, the reason they were opened up is, I mean, let's take the opportunity, but it's really as a result of the Me Too movement. And that breaks my heart that it wasn't an intentional change, that people didn't say, look, there are so many talented women. Why aren't we giving them opportunities? But I feel similarly right now about opportunities for people of color, that without the current climate, we were not willing as an industry to say, but look, we have kept people of color out of this industry for so long, and it's time to stop that. I'm always concerned when one's motivation for doing something is out of obligation instead of out of intention. That said, I'm thrilled with the developments recently for women, but I've thought, as my career progressed, I thought the first 5-10 years, I thought, where are all the women? And 10 years went by, 20 years went by, 30 years went by. It wasn't until the 4th decade, really, of my professional career that there started to be any chinks in this system. And again, it's only a result of this worldwide exposure and spotlight. I wish we as an industry could come to a reckoning and really embrace this new world, which is a world of diversity and needs to be a world of equality for all peoples. And start to create opportunities. Unless we create an educational system that really is open and accessible to everyone, we won't see this kind of diversity on the podiums or on the stages as well. That's another area. In 2002, I was so distressed by the lack of women on the podiums that I started a fellowship for women conductors. And there have been 24 awardees of the Taki Fellowship. And of them, they hold 18 music directorships now. I mean, that's phenomenal. And of course, it's really grown exponentially in the past few years, the opportunities. But I think we need to really be vigilant about staying that course, because it's not the tendency of a club, to leave its comfort zone. And we need to really constantly push that envelope. And now is a great moment for us to look at that. And I hope to be deeply engaged in that work.
It's one of the things that's always fascinated me, I mean, particularly when one thinks of African-American singers, is that actually if you turn the clock back to the sort of 60s and 70s, there were great Black American divas. There was Leontine Price.
Oh, yeah.
There was Shirley Verrett. There was Grace Bunbury. And then moving on. And you just think, what went wrong? Why did that not continue? And I don't really know what the answer is. I mean, I think Jesse Norman suggested that actually the reason that these amazing voices came out at that time is that they all grew up going to church and chapel and singing. And actually, as soon as people stop that and we become a kind of secular society, there isn't that opportunity to sing and the voice to be discovered or the voice to be, encouraged in group singing. And it's a real sadness because, when you think of some of the really, truly great voices of our time, you almost nearly always think of these amazing African. I mean, to me, Leontine Price is just one of
beautiful
the truly
voices,
great voices of ever. Maybe this
without a doubt. But when you think about instrumentalists, it's even a smaller number that come to mind. And you think of I think of Andre Watts, and being a standalone person of color in that time. I mean, can you imagine what he had to go through? But for instrumentalists, unless we create access to learning an instrument from a very, very young age, they'll never have an opportunity, these kids, unless they're really, really young to start. So this has been part of, besides being committed to the musical profile here in Baltimore, I've made a deep, deep commitment to the community. And I hope that through my efforts, the future landscape will look different when people come into the concert hall. The stage will not be just, the same sea of white faces that we've always seen, but it will really reflect the diversity of the community. But without access, without opportunity, as you say, when the opportunities weren't there, it's not a direct pathway.
Now, recording, this is something sort of close to my heart, from Gramophone, that's what we're about. I mean, recording is something that has played, a major role in your career. I mean, how does recording fit in to your sort of musical life? I mean, do you think it's something very, very important?
Oh, I definitely feel that recording is an important part of my trajectory, my commitment. And I've had the great joy of working mostly with Naxos Records from almost the inception of my recording career. I've done several projects for other labels along the way too, but working with Naxos and Klaus Heymann from the beginning, I don't know other record companies where the same person that I spoke to 30 years ago is still heading the company. That is something in itself. He's a visionary business person, but also, from my experience, he's someone who I could always speak to about repertoire and about projects. And he was always open and very receptive to my ideas. So I've been able to cover a huge trajectory of repertoire, going from my first main project was with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, doing all the works of Samuel Barber. This was a revelation for me. I didn't know probably 70% of the works. Fantastic. And then from there, I was able to, with Bournemouth, do a lot of contemporary music, but some standard repertoire. And then something completely different, the Brahms cycle with the LPO, and then going to Sao Paulo, doing a Prokofiev cycle, the entire works, and doing some Bernstein, then coming to Baltimore and Dvorak cycle. I've been able to really focus on and record the repertoire that was interesting to me in that moment in my career. So it's almost like a travelogue for me of my career.
Now you're in Vienna now, the Vienna Radio-Symphonieorchester. Now a radio symphony orchestra is a slightly different beast to, sort of normal, a kind of standalone symphony orchestra. Does that mean that pretty well everything you do is broadcast and therefore recorded?
Yeah, almost every performance is, possibly every performance is recorded for radio. And fortunately and coincidentally, they already had a relationship with Naxos. So we're also recording everything for Naxos. So we're just finishing up our first disc, which is Hindemith, and then following it up with a disc of music by Henze. I feel that this is now my most adventurous recording period, and I'm thrilled about it.
Because presumably a radio symphony orchestra gives there's a certain kind of safety net in that you can be much more, out there when it comes to repertoire. I mean, if you went to the LPO or the LSO and said, I want to do a sort of Hindemith Henze cycle, they'd look at you absolutely appalled and said, well, yes, come back when you bring a few £100,000 with you.
Yeah.
I mean, that must be a nice thing to do.
It's fantastic.
Actually, let's explore something unusual.
James, you're spot on, and this is one of the biggest appeal factors for me, besides that the orchestra is marvelous and the city's gorgeous, but the idea that the repertoire, there's nothing that is off limits. And when I was planning my first concert, I remember working with Christoph Becher, the intendant, on the program, and I said, I'd love to do this Hindemith, this short opera, Sancta Susanna. And he said, why don't you do an all Hindemith program? And I thought, okay, did I really just hear those words out of someone's mouth? And then he said, this was the best one. He said, don't you think we need something edgy to open? So, that kind of artistic openness is really exciting to me.
Because, in Vienna, you've got the Vienna Philharmonic, who, their kind of meat and drink is the sort of the core classical repertoire. Right. So it must give you colossal freedom because you don't have to worry. Not that I'm suggesting you would want to avoid it, but, there's no kind of pressure to say, we've got to do all the Bruckner symphonies and the Beethoven symphonies, the Brahms symphonies. You can go off and explore the repertoire, often quite a lot of local repertoire, I would imagine, in Vienna.
Yes. There's a lot of Austrian contemporary composers that I'm getting to know. It's fantastic. It's a whole new world, a new dimension. But at the same time, they're really excited to do some of the standard works. And we're just finishing up a recording project of all the Schumann symphonies, but in the Mahler versions. So, things like that are a little bit off the beaten track, but still have a connection.
Now you're starting you've just started, as we said, in Austria. How do you balance your sort of career these days? Do you do more, does teaching sort of fill more of your time than just guest conducting and conducting your own orchestras?
Yeah, I've really, I've fallen in love with teaching. I find it very energizing, to work with young people. And so I'm head of the conducting department at the Peabody Institute, and I have a dozen students there every year. So that is giving me a real teaching focus. And then I'm a guest teacher at the university in Vienna as well. Teaching has always been an important part of my life, my professional life, but now I think it's taking even more of a front seat.
How much conducting can you teach? Because I've been to conducting masterclasses, when I was in Estonia a few years ago, and Paavo Järvi was holding a conducting class, and they were working their way through Rachmaninoff's Third Symphony, and each conductor had 15 minutes, and they would step up and they would start conducting. And I was sitting at the back of the orchestra, and I would say probably within about a minute, I could tell whether the conductor kind of had it or hadn't. And I remember at the interval going up to Paavo, and Paavo said to me, "So which do you think is the talented one?" And I said, "Well, it was patently obvious. It was the fourth conductor we heard." And he said, "Absolutely." I mean, we've talked about this sort of magic. I mean, how much sort of magic is there to sort of top up what you can actually teach, or is required perhaps to top up?
Well, I think that there's we're talking maybe about two different things. One is this X factor, this charisma factor that I don't think it's teachable. I think people are born with this. And then the other is a level of competence and musicality that really is exceptional. And that's where I'm trying to get everyone to. I can't control that X factor. I can see it in students, and I can really sort of push those students with that to buckle down and really go for it. But my goal is to try to really see each student for where he or she is, and see how I can amplify their strengths and really try to support their weaknesses so that they can grow as individuals. It's sort of the same goal as being on the podium. You want to create an environment with all the right factors to enable people to grow and become the best they can be.
No, it's as I said earlier on, it's something I find fascinating. I mean, presumably there are certain instances when you work with a student and you just think, actually, this kid has got a real flair for contemporary music.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where I think I should push you. I'm not sure the world is ready for your Brahms 4, but actually, if you wanted to go and give us your Messiaen, I think actually that would really show you off.
But this is about trying to connect your students with their passions. And I speak a lot with them about repertoire and how you build a career, how to define yourself. I mean, as you know, when we first met and my career was early in my career, I was really focused on American repertoire, contemporary music. These were passions of mine. And it gave me a profile and an image and something to distinguish me from every other conductor. So I try to support those passions. And for the young people that don't know what they are yet, I try to get them, listen, go hear things. Come on. What I'm finding, I don't know if you see this too, James, is that because we have so much information at our fingertips, literally now, I find that students aren't as curious. Do you know, when I had to go to the library and dig through 1,000 things, I think I spent more time than they do online, finding things. So I try to encourage them to spend, a good portion of every day looking through scores and listening and trying to find music that speaks to them passionately. Contemporary music, but also older music. Because it's so important that a young conductor find their repertoire. That is really critical. And sometimes they don't see it and I can see it and give them a little bit of direction.
Yeah, because I'm sometimes surprised when talking to, more soloists than conductors. as to how narrow their musical focus is. So, you might talk to a pianist who knows the Beethoven piano sonatas inside out, but you mention a Beethoven string quartet or a violin sonata and they haven't got a clue. And then every now and then you come across somebody and they'll all of a sudden start talking about a string quartet and they're a pianist and you're just thinking, actually, that's kind of more like it. You need the bigger picture, just to say, well, Beethoven, that's 9 symphonies and 5 piano concertos and those are I'm going to learn. It's an incredibly sort of blinkered approach.
Yeah, but sometimes I think the pressure on young musicians is so extreme that they just get this tunnel vision, and they haven't been exposed to teachers who really advocate for a broader view and a bigger picture, even of music. Forget about the world. And I'm a great advocate for educating oneself. I think that it's not just a smart thing to do. It's an absolutely beautifully rewarding thing to do. I mean, if you're a pianist and you don't know those late string quartets, I'm not sure you should be a pianist. I mean, I'm that much of an extremist. Or if you're a conductor and you don't know the late string quartets, that's not okay to me, because it's our responsibility as musicians to know the voice of the creators that we're representing, whether we're instrumentalists or conductors. And that's a huge responsibility and requires a lot of research, a lot of in-depth study. And I think sometimes in our educational system, we're so specialized and we're, how many hours can you practice? How much, this kind of thing, that I think we lose the tree for the forest.
Yeah, because it's funny, I remember at university and we used to have the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra come and play frequently. And when I used to go to concerts, it would not be the music students around me in the audience. It would be the medical students,
right,
and the law students. And that always used to surprise me. But maybe there was an attitude, well, we do enough classical music during the day. In the evenings, we're going to do something else, which I still to this day find quite surprising. But, it's exactly what you were saying.
I had the exact same experience growing up, though. When I was an undergraduate at Yale, I found more intellectual curiosity from my classmates who never became musicians about music than I ever did from my classmates at Juilliard. So something's not quite right in that formula.
No. Well, we probably should draw our conversation to a close. I mean, what's the sort of, what's the next musical milestone for you? I mean, when does life sort of start again?
Well, my family and I are going to head to Vienna probably second week of August and set up shop there for a while, because I don't anticipate things will come back online in the United States at least until 2021. If not well into 2021. Whereas in Vienna, they're starting to play again, and they have concerts planned. We have a couple of festivals to do at the end of August. So I don't know if it'll be business as usual. Who knows what the future will bring, really.
I think one of the, and I've heard this from a couple of musician friends, one of the things that I think a lot of musicians are cherishing about this particular time is that there's one element that has crept back into life, which for many musicians they thought they would never see again, and that's spontaneity. I'm going to go and give a concert next week and I'm going to play X, Y, and Z. Whereas, 3 months ago it was, well, in 3 years' time, I know I'm going to be playing the Beethoven Violin Concerto in Baltimore with Marin conducting. Now it's actually, I can do anything I want. And in a lot of cases, there's nobody telling me, well, you can't play that piece of Schnittke or you can't play that piece of Gershwin.
Yeah.
They just do it. And I think I hope, when all this terribleness is over, it would be lovely if a bit of sort of mercuriality, spontaneity, serendipity would just creep back in a little bit.
No, I agree with you 100%. I think that while this time has been very, very, very difficult for so many people, I think it's also provided us with an opportunity to once again really get in touch with being creative in the moment and rethinking the way we do things. Just because we've done something the same way for 50 years. You know that expression, the tradition is the last bad idea. I really ascribe to that. I think it's time to, let's shake it all up and let's go back and try to reconnect with the reasons we started doing this.
Marin, thank you so much for your time and wisdom, and it's lovely. Oh, it's always lovely to talk to you, and it's been quite a while since we've actually had a really good long chat. So
yeah, it's been great, James. I missed you.
Hugely appreciated. So and best of luck in your second season in Vienna.
Thank you, James. Great to speak to you.
Thank you.